if total factor productivity now increases, again, we come back to our functions. We see, ooh, there's total factor productivity. But guess what? Total factor productivity is down here too. So in this particular case, we end up with two of our functions changing rather than just one. So let's look first at what happens to our per worker production function. So the function rotates higher. Now the first thing to notice, even before we change anything else, capital to labor ratio, the immediate direct effect of that change in total factor productivity is to increase the level of income per worker. That should not be surprising. Right? If workers on average now become more productive, we'll be able to produce more output per worker. That's what we mean by productivity. Right? So if our total factor productivity can improve, then output per worker will improve even if nothing else changes. So this change in economic output here is caused by the direct change in total factor productivity. That's our direct productivity effect. But remember, there's a second change to our investment, saving and investment curve. So as our production function increases, we see higher output per worker, which is also higher income per worker. That higher income per worker with a constant national saving rate means we actually have more saving. If we have more saving, we have more investment. So the investment function shifts up as well. Might think that back, how that works with the saving and investment model. Now again, before we change the capital to labor ratio, let's see what happens. Right here, we see that actual investment per worker is greater than balanced investment per worker, implying that the capital to labor ratio will increase. Now notice that the second effect doesn't look any different than an increase in the saving rate. The second effect on the investment curve, right? We could have gotten the same upward shift. We could have gotten the same upward shift in the saving function had we changed the saving rate. Okay? But here we're not. Here we don't need to. But now, since actual investment is greater than balanced investment, guess what happens? Capital to labor ratio begins to rise. As the capital to labor ratio rises, we move up along our per worker production function. We move up along our new higher saving investment function, and we move up along our balanced investment function. This process continues until we get to a point where actual investment equals balanced investment. Which means we now have a new steady state at point A. Notice at point A, we have a larger capital to labor ratio and yet another increase in income per worker. So one of the really great things about changes in total factor productivity, you get two effects for one event. You get the direct productivity change. That raises us from our steady state S level of income per worker up to our red income per worker. That's just our direct effect from productivity change. But that also leads to a secondary indirect effect. Because it increases saving and investment, it also increases the capital to labor ratio. And that increase in the capital to labor ratio also causes an increase in output per worker. So this second effect is due to the change in the capital to labor ratio. It turns out that that secondary effect is actually quite important. In the United States, based on a Cobb-Douglas production function with an output elasticity for labor of around 0.7, that secondary effect is worth 40% of the direct effect. So think about what that means. If the productivity was going to give you a 10% increase, you're now going to get a 14% increase. If you're going to get a 1% increase, now you're going to get a 1.4% increase. Go back to that chart that we looked at the beginning of last lecture. It showed all those countries from 1870 to 2005. Look at that last column and how little difference there was between their average annual growth rates. And then think about what it means if productivity is the driving force. Changes in total factor productivity give you one-for-one the direct effect, but they also give you the add-on effect of another 40%. And that extra 40% over a long period of time can make a huge, huge difference in average standards of living. What a mess. Okay, so again, we get a direct effect, and we also get an indirect effect. Now, what has China done? So again, if we look out over the last 30 years, 20 years in China, one of the things that we would see is that measured total factor productivity has actually increased quite substantially. This, by the way, is not particularly unusual for a rapidly growing developing country. Many developing countries, before they enter their rapid growth phase, are heavily agricultural in nature, with a substantial portion of the population engaged in subsistence agriculture. By definition, subsistence agriculture means you're not very productive, right? You're able to grow enough food and other types of things to keep yourself alive, but not a whole lot to enter into the market economy. So think about somebody working on a subsistence farm that works on there for an entire year, right? They grow enough to keep their family alive and to keep going, stay warm during the winter, clothe themselves, blah, 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 but not much else. Now take that same person have them migrate out of the rural agricultural area into an urban or suburban manufacturing sector. Now remember, we're moving 1 man year or woman year of effort out of agriculture, where there's not being much produced, into manufacturing. Even if the value added in manufacturing is low, you're now working for 48, 50, 52 weeks out of the year, right? Producing something. So simply moving that worker out of subsistence agriculture and into manufacturing raises the level of total factor productivity for the economy. The average level of total factor productivity rises. One of the things that we've seen in China is a massive movement of migrants from rural areas to manufacturing areas. And yes, I understand not everybody in a rural area was in subsistence agriculture, and not everybody who made the move turns out to have massive increases in their personal total factor productivity, but there's been enough of that movement to increase their total factor productivity quite significantly. Again, notice the effect. The steady state would move out to the right. Income per worker would rise. During the transition phase, the economy would grow faster. So notice in all three of the examples that we talked about, an increase in the saving rate, China went from 10 to 45%. A reduction in the labor force growth rate, China went from about 2.5% to about 1%. An increase in total factor productivity. All three of those are going to cause the steady state to move further out to the right. The economy is always moving to catch up with that steady state. It's in a transition period for a long period of time. So income per capita is rising very quickly for a long period of time. So again, the Solow model goes a long way to helping us understand what's happened in China over the last 20, 25 years. Remember, this is a very simple model, right? It doesn't need to be incredibly complex to give us a broad brush conclusions about what's happened in China. Now, let's think about China for the next 20 or 30 years. Again, on the basis of the Solow model that we're looking at. So the first thing we want to ask ourselves, over the next 20 or 30 years, is China's saving rate likely to go up, stay the same, or go down? I would argue that China's saving rate is going to go down. As the economy gets richer and richer, Chinese consumers are going to want to have more and more say in what the composition of output is. Consumption in China today is only 30% of GDP. When you look at other countries that were at a similar point in their development, whether it was Japan or South Korea or other countries that are above China today but came through that same general standard of living, their consumption to GDP levels were higher and continue to move higher, so that they're much, much closer to Western standards today. So if China's consumption to GDP ratio rises, one of the things that's going to mean is lower saving. So if the saving rate comes down, what happens? Now the steady state moves to the left, or at least it doesn't move as far to the right from other factors. How about the labor force growth rate? China's already got a one-child policy. They're not going to go to a zero-child policy, right? Or a half-child policy. And also, it's unlikely that the labor force growth rate is going to slow any more than what it already has. And in fact, the policy discussion in China now is relaxing the one-child policy, which might actually mean that 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, we might actually see faster labor force growth. So if the saving rate is likely to come down and the labor force growth rate is not likely to change much, China's growth is going to be primarily dependent on what happens to total factor productivity. But the massive move of workers from the rural areas to the urban areas, the massive move is probably over. It's not to say that there won't be continued migration, there will be. But the big changes have probably already happened over the last 20 years. It's hard to imagine the next 20 years China's going to move as many people in that direction. So you're going to lose that source of productivity gains. So thinking about what the Solow model tells us and making reasonable assumptions about saving rate, labor force growth rates, and total factor productivity suggests that over the next 20 or 25 years, China cannot grow as fast as it has over the last 20 or 25 years. That does not mean that China's not going to grow a whole lot faster than the United States or Western Europe or Japan or many other countries. It's likely to continue to grow fairly quickly, but we're not likely to see 8, 9, 10% average annual growth rates. By the way, this model also helps us to understand why Japan is seeing very little economic growth over the last 20 years. Okay? So Japan's population today, as well as its labor force, is smaller today than it was 10 years ago. Okay? So think about that. Japan's labor force growth rate is negative. Now that does not mean the balanced investment line has a negative slope. Right? The balanced investment line is labor force growth plus depreciation. So as long as depreciation is greater than the decline in the labor force growth rate, you still have a positive slope to the balanced investment line. But what it does suggest is that the economy is not going to grow very fast in the steady state. Right? If there were no productivity gains, in fact, Japan's economy would shrink. So Japan's economy, to the extent that it's going to grow at all over the last 10 years, let alone over the next 10 or 20 years, is going to be dependent entirely upon productivity changes rather than changes in the size of the labor force or the capital to labor ratio. So notice that this Solow model is actually a very, very simple model. Now, you may not think that it's that simple, but we've only got 4 exogenous variables and 3 functions and, 4 endogenous variables, but it's actually quite robust in giving us a big picture story about what is happening on average in a variety of countries. Okay, where are we here? Okay, now the question that we need to ask ourselves is, if we remember that stylized chart that we looked at the beginning of Tuesday's class, where we had our 3,500-year, 3,600-year period of economic output per worker in the Mediterranean European area. So remember, we saw from 1500 BCE to about 1800 CE, no change at all. Almost no change at all in economic output per worker. We know the labor force grew during that period of time, which means that if we were in the steady state, the capital stock had to grow at that period of time. But if there was no change in income per worker, it also meant the economy grew exactly in line with the labor force. In the context of the Solow model, what that means is during that entire period of time, changes in total factor productivity were virtually zero. And we've also seen that since then, we've had this huge increase, especially since 1850. Huge increase in income per worker, much greater than what we can account for by labor force growth rate or by savings growth rates. So it must be, in the context of our model, that we've had huge changes in total factor productivity. And in fact, what we can see is that when we want to move through a policy mechanism, our steady state further and further to the right so we can have a higher and higher level of income per worker, We can't raise the saving rate too high. Right? Somewhere around 90 some odd percent, you starve to death. That's not much fun. So we're not going to raise the savings rates to any particularly high numbers, especially on a national basis. Labor force growth rates can only slow so much, so they're not likely to be our major source of rising income per worker. But total factor productivity is one of those things that can continue to grow. And as we'll see on Tuesday, total factor productivity is actually the dominant factor in explaining long-term economic growth. So we'll look at that on Tuesday, and then we'll also look at a number of things that the government can do to affect total factor productivity. Don't forget, problem set number 2 is due on Tuesday. We will have our boxes at the door, so have a wonderful weekend working on your problem set.